Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to look at some financial terms and we're going to look at um, kind of investment alternatives or savings alternatives. And so investment or savings alternatives. Okay, hope everyone is doing well. We're approaching very rapidly the end of the school semester, although it kind of feels weird, obviously. Um, so there are different goals for investing, and so I want to list the um, different places you can put your money and what the objectives are for the money. There's normally different reasons and different time horizons and lots of different factors that need to be considered. Um, so there we go. So let's start with places to put your money. And we'll list, pros and cons and stuff like that. So places to put your money. So first place and the most obvious place for most people is in the bank. But within the bank, there are different kinds of accounts. So in the bank, there is a savings account. There is a checking account. Those are the two big ones. Okay. But there's other places. So within a bank, so a savings account. What is a savings account? It's in theory, why would we do that? So a savings account offers slightly higher interest than a checking account. Slightly greater interest than a checking account. Now, times might change again, but right now they're both so low that bank accounts, it's almost not even worth counting what the interest rate is. So, the interest rate for a savings account can be anywhere from like 0.1%, literally, like not 10%, like that's not like it is as a decimal. As a decimal, that is, we're talking 0.001. So that's as a decimal, right? So when I say 0.1%, I mean, 1/10 of 1%. And it can go all the way up to, in theory, there are some things that are paying approaching 3%. If you can get 3% in a savings account, you got something special going on there. It means either you've got an inordinate amount of money, or you are dealing with a bank that offers virtually no services. So, like it used to be President's Choice, sometimes it's called Simply Financial, and there's Tangerine, stuff like that. So, what impacts the rate? So, what impacts what the percentages are is, how much money you have saved, so how much money is in the account. And the more money you have in the account, often it will take you to a higher tier of interest. So how much money is in the account? And the other big thing that impacts it is how many services you can access. Okay, so generally speaking, if you're in a higher interest savings account, it has restrictions on it. You're not able to access your money all that frequently. And they probably might not have a physical location you could go in and talk to. It might have to be done entirely online. So certainly those are drawbacks. The other big one is, usually with a savings account, you will get no free transactions usually. So what that means is, even if you deposit money, it will cost you money to deposit money in some savings account. So let's say you had a savings account, had $500 in it, and you wanted to, you got a paycheck or you got a check for your birthday for $200, and you want to go and deposit that. You'll make a deposit for $200, but only like $198.50 will actually go into the bank, because it will, cost you on a transaction. Or if you want to find out what your balance is, in some cases, you're like, I don't know how much money I have in my account. I'm going to go and check. And if you go and check, that can cost you. So no free transactions of any sort in some cases. Okay, so it's extremely limiting, but it does, it offers a bit of interest, and there's absolutely no risk whatsoever. Okay, so your money will never go down, and even if something bad happens to the bank, um, interest rate or bank accounts in Canada are guaranteed, and I don't know what the number is because they change it relatively regularly, but any one bank account in Canada, I'm just going to ballpark here. At one point in time, it was $50,000. So, like, imagine that you had, your money with, it doesn't matter, any of the bank accounts, like CIBC, and somehow through some ridiculous set of circumstances, CIBC went out of business, and you had $45,000 in the bank, and you go to get it out, and CIBC is gone. Um, the Bank of Canada, so the government guarantees your investment. So there's absolutely no risk, and it's guaranteed. So your money is guaranteed. It is safe, safe, safe. Okay, so that's a savings account. It's easy to access, right? Easy to access, so that's a nice thing. Any bank machine in theory you can do it. Most people are doing a lot of stuff online now or through your phone or lots of stuff like that. So there's a savings account. Checking account. A checking account, generally speaking, most of them pay 0% interest. Most of them pay 0% interest. And over and above that, most of them, in fact, pretty much all of them, you actually have to pay a fee to have the account. Um, okay, so it might be $12 a month or $15 a month just for the privilege of having that bank account. And what do you get out of that? Well, what you get back from paying that fee is you, generally speaking, get free transactions, right? So when you go to Tim Hortons and buy your bagel and a coffee and you use tap or you use debit, it doesn't cost you anything. Whereas if you did that, so say you had $20 in your savings account, you went to Tim Hortons and it was a $10 bill, you tapped, um, you know, it would actually end up costing you like $11.50 or $12, right? Because every transaction, generally speaking, you have to pay for in a savings account, but over in a checking account, you don't have to do that. So you get free transactions. Most checking accounts, although they're not all that frequent anymore, you get free checks as well. So if you have to pay your rent or pay for stuff, checks are far less prominent now than they used to be. When I was a kid, people, they'd go to the grocery store and they'd write a check for their groceries, or they'd go to the hardware store and they'd write a check, right? So checks are less prominent. Generally speaking, now people use it for paying their rent potentially, or if you have you have to buy a big thing. But by and large anymore, checks have kind of gone by the wayside. So you get free transactions, you get free checks. Um, a lot of them you'll get free money orders. So if you're buying something on eBay or something like that, but again, that's all changed because people use PayPal. So a checking account, it's you know usually that's where you're going to get your wages will be auto deposited into, right. Um, and then in the same way as a savings account and being guaranteed by the government, a checking account is the exact same, right? So a checking account pays 0% interest, um, compared to, honestly, savings accounts are usually no more than 1%, um, at the upper end. And so a checking account, you don't pay any interest, you don't get any interest paid, but you get free transactions and you get free checks and you get stuff like that and free services and stuff. Um, the checking account is the one, like, fewer and fewer people have savings accounts anymore. Checking account, pretty much everyone has to have. Like, it's honestly, it would be almost impossible. It's pretty much a must have as an adult, right? You don't really have a choice, right? So when you go get a job, they're going to say, give me your transaction ID numbers, and we will, set up auto deposit. And some of you have probably already done this if you already have a part-time job at like Independent or something like that. So that's a checking account. So these are different places that you can put your money, but your money is not really earning you back very much. So if you put $5,000 in your checking account at the end of the year, you're going to have $5,000 in your checking account. It's not going to grow because it pays 0% interest. And if you put it into your savings account, let's say you got, you know, $5,000 in your savings account and you get 1% interest. And that seems low, but honestly, that's better than most savings accounts. You'd end up at the end of the year with $5,050. So you earn a little bit of interest, but admittedly, not very much. And in fact, there's something in the world called inflation. And I'm gonna define this as an aside. It's worth you guys knowing. I'm sure you've probably heard of inflation. So inflation, and that is just the trend of prices to increase over time. Okay, so the idea behind inflation is, when I was a kid, when I was your age, when I was 15, or you guys are 16, let's say 15, because for me that's 30 years ago, $100 would buy a lot of stuff, right? Because things cost less. Like a pop and a pop machine when I was a kid was 50 cents, whereas a pop and a pop machine now is at least a buck, or in some cases $2. Gas. I can remember when I had my first car at 16, gas cost as low as 38, 39 cents per liter, whereas now it's kind of low now, but like $1 per liter. So inflation is is just the trend of prices to increase. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because if you put $5,000 in a bank account and you let it sit for 10 years and it doesn't increase, it's still $5,000. It's sort of worth less, right? Because the price of everything else has gone up. So the $5,000 at the beginning could have bought a certain number of things. If you went to buy those same things at the end of 10 years, you're not going to be able to buy as many of them. So even though it's still $5,000, it's worth less than what it was. So inflation causes the value of your money to decrease because the value of goods increases. So the problem with a checking account that only pays like 1%, you're actually still sort of losing money because in Canada, inflation historically has hovered in the upper 1% region. So 1.6, 1.7, 1.8%. So if your bank account is paying 1% and inflation is 1.8%, you're effectively losing 0.8% of your money per year that you let it sit there. Okay. So bank accounts generally, the reason we use them is because we have to for making transactions, for shopping, and for auto deposits and stuff like that. But really, these are not what I would consider, not really investments. Because investments, we're hoping our value of money is going to go up. Okay. So this is a temporary storage area for money. Okay. And that's again because inflation causes the value of money to go down. And if you're not making more interest than inflation, you are losing money. Okay. So that's what a bank account is. So where else can we put our money? Well, um, within banks is where most people actually, put their money as investments, but not just in a bank account or in a savings account or in a checking account. Even though it's called a savings account anymore, that's not really true. And that's why savings accounts are not really all that big a thing anymore. Um, so then where we put investments, right? So investments. So I'm going to kind of go over on a high level the different investments or yeah. So yeah, let's just talk. So there are some big things that we save money for. So one of the biggest things that we want to save money is in RRSP, and then I'm going to compare and contrast that down here to a relatively new innovation, and that is a TFSA. So an RRSP is a registered retirement savings plan. Okay, so RRSP, a registered retirement, let me get a different color, a registered retirement savings plan. And what it is, first off, is obviously you're going to take money, you're going to put it somewhere until you retire. Okay. And so obviously it is savings for retirement. Okay, so it's a place we're going to save our money, and so we're going to, when we're doing our taxes, we're going to earmark. We're going to say, hey, this money was put into an official RRSP, and why that is important. So it's a savings for retirement. Why it's important? An RRSP is a you put in tax-free dollars, so it's tax-free on deposit, and it grows tax-free, but we pay tax on withdrawal. Okay, so I think a diagram, like a kind of a timeline of what's going on. So you get a paycheck, so you're adulting now, or you're even teening now. You get a paycheck. Let's say that your paycheck is for $1,000 for the week. That is going to be your gross pay. So gross pay is how much money the company is allocating to you, but it's not how much money you get. So if you make $20 an hour and you worked 50 hours this week, your gross pay would be 20 times 50, $1,000. Okay, but off of that, we're going to subtract all kinds of things. So we're going to subtract off income tax, both provincial and federal. So income tax is going to come off. CPP is going to come off. The Canadian Pension Plan is going to come off. And various other things might come off. And so after all of these things have come off of your paycheck, you might only end up with $700. And that is your net pay. And that's how much money is going to go into your bank account. So in theory, you earned $1,000, but there's all of these other things that came off, and you only get your net pay. Well, when you put money into your RRSP, the income tax portion doesn't actually come off. And the income tax portion is the biggest deduction that you're going to have, right? So there's two different ways this can work. So sometimes, depending on how your employer's pay services work, the employer might not care. The employer might just say, here's $700. You're like, bah. And they took that money out. But let's say you take that $700 and you put it into your RRSP. You weren't supposed to pay tax on that $700. So what happens is in April, when you file your taxes, or in March if you're earlier, you'll say, but I put $700 into my RRSP. And the government will say, oh, well, the income tax that you paid on that $700, you shouldn't have paid, and you will get a refund for that amount. So that's one way it can happen, is if you take after-tax dollars, so this money right here, you put it into your RRSP, the tax program, so like quick tax or whatever, or if you do it old school with pencil and paper, you send that off to the Canada Revenue Agency. They say, oh, well, we took off too much tax, so that shouldn't have been there, and they'll give you that money back. And you can do whatever you want with it. A wise choice would maybe to be and take it and put it also into your RRSP, or whatever. And so an RRSP, it's tax-free on deposit. Okay. So then, you've got your money percolating away in your RRSP. So you've got this pot of money that's in there. It's like, there's my investments. They're in your RRSP, and we're going to talk about what those investments could be. And it grows, hopefully, and hopefully the mix of investments that you have gives you a decent return on your investment. And so let's say that you had that $1,000 in your RRSP, and you earned 20%. You found some good investment, and so that $1,000 then becomes $1,200. Well, that additional $200 is income, but it gets to grow tax free in your RRSP. Okay. And so you don't pay any income tax on that right then. Whereas if you took, a different $1,000 and you invested it and it grew to $1,200, if it wasn't in your RRSP, that $200 increase, depending on what the investment was, gets taxed. So it could be capital gains, it could be interest, it could be a lot of different things, but it does get taxed. So gains that you get on investments not in an RRSP or a TFSA are taxed, but anything that's in either of these vessels don't get taxed. Okay, so savings for retirement, you put it in and it's tax free when you put it in. So that means you'll either get a refund on your taxes the year you put it in, or you didn't pay the tax to begin with. It gets to grow tax free while it's in there. And then when you reach your retirement age, hopefully you have a big kettle that has all of your RRSP money in it. And that serves as kind of your income for when you are retired. And so you're going to take money out of your RRSP after you are retired. Well, when you take the money out, so let's say that this year, when you're 60, you need to take $50,000 out of your RSP. That sounds like a huge number, but I'm promising you, when you get there, those are the kinds of numbers, well, it'll be even higher than that. You're going to pay that as though it was income, because it is income. And then you pay tax on the money when you take it out. Okay, so if you withdraw $50,000 when you're 60, it gets taxed just the same as if you had a job that you made $50,000. So you put it in tax free, gets to grow tax free, but when you withdraw it, it is taxed as income. So you pay tax on withdrawal as income. Okay, so it's a tax deferral. Now, the idea for a lot of people is that you make more money before you are retired than what you do while you are retired. Okay, so let's say that you have a decent government job or a decent contracting job or whatever, and right before you retire, you're making $100,000 a year. Income tax is um, it's not taxed, it's incremental tax brackets, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But the hope is that the money that you take out when you are withdrawing from your RRSP, you will be in a lower tax bracket than you were when you deposited it. So you get a net savings on income tax by doing it later. Confusing stuff, I realize. Okay, that's an RRSP. A TFSA, again, that's a relatively new thing in the grand scheme of the financial world. TFSA is a tax free, not tax tree, a tax free savings account. Okay, so a tax free savings account, meaning, of course, that what happens there is it's sort of similar to an RRSP, but it's kind of backwards. So a tax-free savings account, the way that it works is you have to put in, you deposit after, that's not an R, after tax dollars. Okay, so we put in after tax dollars. So up here, where in theory that $1,000 could have gone directly into your RSP and grown and grown and grown and all good, and then you pay tax on the way out. In this one, you put the $700 in because you have to have paid taxes on the stuff before you put it into your tax-free savings account. And you're like, well, how's that tax-free? Well, the way it's tax-free is you put in after tax dollars, you deposit after tax dollars, it grows tax-free, and you get a tax-free withdrawal. Okay, so if you had $300,000 in your tax-free savings account when you retired, you could take $50,000 out of your tax-free savings account and you get to keep $50,000 because it's already been taxed before you put it in. So it doesn't get taxed when you take it out. Okay, So a tax-free savings account offers the huge advantage that you don't pay taxes on withdrawal. Okay. And it's really hard to decide, um, when you're working. So let's say you're 30 and you're starting to save for your retirement. Hopefully, we'll do it earlier. We looked at how big a difference it makes to start early. But you're trying to decide, well, should I be putting money in my tax-free savings account or be putting money into my RRSP? And and the taxation system changes every year. Every year it gets different, and the rules change. And that's why people complain. Well, why don't you teach kids how to do taxes in high school? Well, because it changes every year. And so for that same reason, I can't offer you distinct advice for what the best place for you to put your money is, because I could give you advice right now that would not be sound later on. And I could give, advice to Jake that is relevant, but it might be completely the wrong information for, um, for Emily. It doesn't matter. It's different on an individual basis. So that's where having a trustworthy financial advisor is really, really important. They can help you make the right decisions. Okay. So we have an RRSP and a TFSA. Those are probably the two biggest savings vehicles that most of you will ever have in your life, right? Those are probably the biggest things that you're going to, the biggest kettles that you'll ever store money. Okay. Now, how that money is stored in them is a little bit different. One other one that I think is worth noting and is relevant to a lot of you right now is an RESP. And an RESP is a registered education education savings plan. Okay. And so what an RESP is, and so I've got one for my daughter, and I'm sure some of you may have parents or guardians or other people who have them for you. It is a place that you can put money, and it's after tax money. Um, and what happens is the government does a matching of that up to 20%, on up to, the last I looked was on up to $2,000 per year. So and again, these things change. So please forgive me if it's not exactly those numbers now. Last I looked, it was that. So the government will match 20% of your investment up to a max of, so the government's contribution was a max of $400. So that meant a $2,000 investment. So that might not seem like a big deal, but that is a really big deal, because if you or your parents or your guardians or your aunts or your uncles, if they put $2,000 into the bank and mark it as an RESP, okay, the government will say, okay, here's an additional $400, which is 20%. And that's an amazing return, right? Like if you could get a 20% return on your money all the time, you'd be made in the shade. You could retire at the age of 30. And so it only happens once, right? But you can keep on. So every year with my wee one, we've put money away, and the government matches your investment. Now, so those are kind of the big different kettles that you can put your money into. Um, you might have other, like people have other different things depending on what their life situation is and what their priorities are. Like some people have, a vacation account, right? And they put away $50 every paycheck into their vacation account. And that might be why they have a savings account, because it's not going to be in there all that long. And so they put $50 every paycheck away. And then maybe at the end of 3 years, they've got enough money to take themselves or their family to an all-inclusive in Cuba or something like that. Or some people have, another big thing that people save up for is they might have a, like basically what amounts to a deposit account. So if you have to save 5% for your mortgage and your house is going to cost $400,000, that means that you're going to have to save $20,000. So maybe you have a mortgage deposit account that you put money away into. But the biggest thing that most people are going to have are an RRSP, a TFSA, and depending on whether you have kids or not, and whether you have money or not, an RESP. Okay, so those are the big things that we put away for. So highlight again, RRSP is the Registered Retired Savings Plan. You put tax-free money in, it gets to grow tax-free, but it gets taxed when you take it out. A TFSA, it serves nearly the same purpose. Normally, most people are putting money into a TFSA for their retirement as well, but you deposit after tax dollars, it gets to grow tax-free, and it is a tax-free on withdrawal. So it just depends on your income situation, which one of those is advantageous to you. And I'm not going to suggest I know which is the best for you. It's hard to even know which is the best for me, frankly. And that's where financial advisors come into play. And so you find yourself a trustworthy financial advisor, and they will help you decide what the best idea for you is. Okay. Now, those are kind of the big kettles. Now, where can we actually invest? So, like, this is kind of weird. So this is what you're investing for, or what you're investing in, but the vehicle where you put your money, how you get your money to grow, is what we're going to talk about now. So, investments to grow. Okay. Now, if we think about investments to grow, almost everybody, when in class, we would talk about this, and I'd say, hey, how do you get your money to grow? And somebody, and for sure, is going to say stocks. Okay. And absolutely stocks or shares. Okay. And we're absolutely going to talk about that. Another place that we can get our money to grow is going to be, come back here, in bonds. And I'm going to put in here also T-bills, and I'll talk about what that is in a second. And then another one that you might not be familiar with, but your parents or guardians almost certainly would be, and that is mutual funds. Okay, those are the big ones, and I'm not gonna try and mislead you. There are dozens of others, right? And again, that's where a really trustworthy financial advisor is there to help you out, or mom or dad or guardian or aunt or uncle. If they're successful, they can help you out. I have a brother-in-law who is actually a financial advisor, and so I talk with him a fair amount, although I don't always take his advice. So, stocks or shares, some of you might have a pretty good idea of what that is, and others of you might not. So really, what a stock or share is it is a part ownership of the company. Okay, so if you decide I want to buy some, and the kids are always like, I'm gonna go check Apple, so part ownership of a company. If you buy some shares or stocks in Apple, AAPL on the NASDAQ, um, it means that you actually own a part of that company. Okay, so it's part ownership of the company. You own part of it. If you bought, now you couldn't, because there's literally not enough money that any one person has, but if you bought enough of those stocks or shares, you would own the company, right? And so in movies, you sometimes hear about things called a hostile takeover. And the way a hostile takeover works is, you might go to, Bob's t-shirt shop and say, I'd like to buy your company. And Bob's like, no, screw that. I'm not selling my company. But the company has stocks and shares in the market. And you're like, all right, fine. And you go and you just start buying. You're like, hey, I'd like to buy your stocks of Bob's company. And you talk to enough people. If you buy enough of those stocks or shares, and you have more than 50% of the entire value of the company in stocks or shares, it is now your company. And that is a hostile takeover, right? The company didn't want you to buy the company, but you go and you buy enough pieces of the company that you have the majority shareholder. You own the company. Now, there are other weird circumstances that can preclude that from happening, like there's sometimes a golden share and stuff like that, but we're not going to get into that. Generally speaking, if you buy enough of the stocks or shares, you buy more than half of them, you own the company and you get to decide what happens with it. And so that's what a hostile takeover. So, part ownership of the company is what happens when you have stocks or shares. How do you make money with stocks or shares? Okay, so there are two methods to make money. Okay, so one method is um, something called a stock dividend. So if you've ever played Monopoly and you get community chest and it's like stock dividends, collect $100 from the bank. I don't remember if that's the right number. So what happens is that stock dividends generally come from something called these are coming from companies called blue chip companies generally. And so a stock dividend is you buy a really stable company that just does its thing. So let's say that you're like Coca-Cola is a really, really stable company that every year makes a decent amount of money. Okay. And so the company has profit. So let's say that this year the company had $1 billion in profit, which sounds like a ridiculous number, but there are lots of companies that have that amount of profit. They take that profit and they share it with everybody who owns the company, right? That's why it's called shares. And so if you own 1% of the company, you would get 1% of that profit as a dividend. They would actually cut you a check. It used to be a check that would come in the mail. Anymore now they would cut you a check and it would be direct deposited to your investment account or to your checking account. Okay. And so stock dividend is you get to keep or you're paid a share of the profit. Okay. So again, it's a bit more complex than that because just because a company makes $1 billion in profit doesn't mean that $1 billion is going to be shared equally to the shareholders. They might say, well, we want to do some new research on new Coke 2, and it's going to cost us $100 million to do new research. So sometimes that money is used to invest into the company to make the company bigger and better so that hopefully later on they make more money. Okay. And so a stock dividend it comes from, generally speaking, stable companies and it's a share of the profit. Okay, so every year you get a chunk of the profit. So stock dividends are one of the two main ways that you can make money off of stocks. Okay, so some of you might have heard of a guy named Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett is one of the richest men in the world. He's known as the Sage of Omaha, and he, typically speaking, invests in companies that pay dividends. He likes companies that are stable and that pay dividends. So he's a big fan of Coca-Cola, for instance. He's a big fan of Gillette razors, and he invests in Gillette. There's lots of companies like that that are kind of boring companies, but they make money every year. And so he puts his money there and it gets a return. And so, depending on how successful the company is, that dictates how much the return is. So, let's say that, as an example, the share is trading, which means that that's what its value is trading at, we'll make it easy, $50 per share. And maybe this year that you get a $2 dividend. Well, $2 on $50 a share is a 4% return. So you would hope to get more than that, but a 4% return is still dramatically better than what you're going to get by leaving it in a bank, right? And so the more stable a company is, generally speaking, the lower the dividends are often, but not always. Okay. So one way to make money off of stocks or shares is through a dividend. Okay. So you go out, you buy the stocks and the shares, and you get them, and you get your dividends every year, and you're like, or sometimes quarterly, and you're like, huzzah, I have made money. And that is how you make money off stocks and shares. That's one way. The second way is to buy low and sell high. Okay. So if you think a company is going to go and do really, really well, so you learn about this new startup company called Tesla, and you're like, Tesla is selling shares for $50 each right now. And you think, you know what? I think this Tesla company, it's going to do big things and it's going to do amazing stuff. And people are going to get to know this Tesla and want to get in on Tesla. So maybe you buy your shares at $50 and everybody out there is like, ooh, that Tesla's doing good stuff. And they start buying and start buying. And there aren't enough shares to go around. And so, all of the shares were bought for $50, and now everybody that has them doesn't really want to sell them. And so you've got your shares for $50, and someone's like, "I'd like to buy those from you for $50." And you're like, "No, no, I like it." And they're like, "Well, how about I give you $55 for it?" And you're like, "No, I still kind of like it the way it is." And then they're like, "Well, I'll give you $60." And you're like, $60. I put in $50. Someone wants to give me $60. Yeah, maybe I'll do that. Right. And so that's actually what drives the price of shares up is it's a scarce commodity and people want to buy it. Right. And so the idea is that they buy them. And when people have high demand, it drives the price up. So you hope that you buy low and good things happen to the company and it causes the price of shares to go up, and then you sell at a higher price than what you paid for it, and that difference is the profit that you make off of that. That is how you get your investment to grow, is you buy it low and you sell it high. And so generally speaking, some stocks that will still pay dividends like that, but normally it's one way or the other. If you're counting on dividends, you're not going to buy it and then sell it, because if you sell it, you're not going to get dividends anymore, right? So typically speaking, there's two different ways that you make money: it's to buy low and sell high, or you are getting dividends. Now, most people, when they're looking at what's happening in the stock market, buy low, sell high is very much the sexier way. It's the more interesting way that people are making money when they're talking about the stock market. When they're talking about dividends, generally speaking, that's not what the movies are about and the TV shows are about and the espionage and the trade secrets and stuff like that. It's the buy low and sell high. Okay. Now, those are the two main methods of making money off of stocks or shares. It's not the only way, but those are the ways we're going to talk about. So, why wouldn't everybody just drop their money into stocks and shares? Well, it's risky, right? If it's money in a bank account, it is guaranteed not to go down, and it's guaranteed even if something bad happens to the bank, that you get the money from the government. So your money is really, really, really safe. Whereas with stocks and shares, um, if something bad happens to the company, all of a sudden their share price can plummet. It can go way, way, way down. And just because you bought them for $100, going to sell them later on, there's no guarantee that you're going to get 100 or 105 or $110. You might get substantially less than that. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick story. And at school, I would pull out a couple of graphs. There was everyone here knows what Bell Canada is. Bell Canada had a subsidiary called Nortel. And when I was in university, Nortel was a big deal. Nortel was making a lot of the infrastructure for the internet. Actually, like a lot of the internet runs on stuff that Nortel designed and used to make. And so Nortel was a juggernaut. It just kept on going up and 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 up. And at its peak, Nortel was selling for about $120 per share. Then somebody did some research, and it turns out that some of the stuff that Nortel said was happening, their accounting people had sort of lied. And everyone was like, oh crap, it's maybe not worth that much. So it was selling for $120. And then it started to drop and drop and drop and drop and drop. And at its lowest, Nortel got to 70 cents. So that means if you put $1,000 of your money into Nortel shares, if you didn't get out somewhere along the way, if you waited till it got down to there, your $1,000 was now worth about $60. So you put $1,000 in, and inside of a month, it was now worth $60. So you put $1,000 away, and you ended up with 60. Not something that you want to have happen. Now, Nortel is not the only company that this has happened to, but anybody who's done investing for any length of time has stories of how stocks have just fallen and fallen and fallen. Okay. And it gets so volatile and people are losing their mind. My dad used to work for Bell, and there were lots of guys who he worked with who had shares of Nortel just before they were retired that were worth almost $1 million. And they were going to use that as their retirement nest egg, and then the market fell out and it went from being worth $1 million to being worth not even 10,000. Okay. So you've heard that expression of don't putting all your eggs in one basket. That's why. Okay. So shares are somewhat risky. That's one reason that you wouldn't want to buy shares. A second reason is that shares you must buy in blocks of 100. So you can't go and say, I want to buy one share. You have to buy 100 at a minimum. You buy blocks of 100 of them. So if a share is going for $50, let's say that you have $1,000 that you want to put away. You couldn't buy a block of shares in that company that's trading for $50 because the fewest that you can buy is 100 of them. So 100 times 50 is $5,000. So a company that's trading for $50 a share, the lowest investment that you can make is $5,000. Okay. And so you must buy in blocks of 1,000. So even if you maybe have enough money to buy a block of 100 shares, that may be all of your money. And you don't want to put all of your money in one place. Okay. So you must buy in blocks of 100. Okay. And the other thing that is a detriment is they're very volatile, which means that stuff moves up and down rapidly. And so if you are a nervous Nelly, up and down rapidly is 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 something that scares a lot of people. Okay, so if you look at even a share that's doing pretty well, it doesn't just go like that. It does stuff like this, and you can look at trend lines, and the trend might be generally speaking going up. But what happens with a lot of people is it goes up and up and up and up and up, and then it starts to go down. And they're like, I got to get out now, and so they sell right there, and they don't hold it until it goes back up. And maybe if they hold it once and it starts to go back down, they're like, and they get out there, right? So if it depends on how tolerant to volatility you are, will dictate whether it's a good idea for you to invest in shares or stocks. And so if you get a good financial advisor, they will talk to you about how risk averse you are and how well you can weather a volatile thing. Now, the other thing about stocks and shares is to go from here to here, that might be, 2 years, right? And so you might have to hold on to it for another 3 years for it to go back up. And so if you're going to need your money right away, you might have to sell it here, even if you know it's going to go back up. So it's called your investment horizon is really important as well, deciding how long you need to put your money away for. Okay. And again, a financial advisor will help you with that. So stocks or shares, it's part ownership of a company. Two main methods to make money. Stock dividends is one way, and that's generally off of a very stable company. Like if you look at stock dividend chart, a company might be increasing slightly, right? But you're more counting on these payouts that you get all along. That's where you're making your money from generally. So stock dividends, it's pretty stable, and so the stock will not look crazy like this, or a buy low, sell high. That one, if that's the strategy, it's going to be much more volatile. And the hope is that you can get in here and get out there, right? And that's the idea behind that. And so back when I was just first graduated from university, there was something called day trading. And you talk about a short amount of time that people invested for. Like long-term investors invest in companies for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Day traders were literally that. They would buy a stock in the morning and sell it at night with the hopes of, maybe in the morning it was trading for $1.50 and at night it's trading for $1.80. And that increase is they're going to take that 30 cent per share increase to bed with them. And so every day at the end of the day, their hope was is they didn't own any stocks. They'd buy them first thing in the morning and they'd sell them at the end of the day. And that's how day trading worked. Now, day trading is a lot less common now than it was, but people still do some day trading. Okay. So stocks or shares. Now, when you have an RRSP and you're putting money away into your RRSP, it's not just necessarily sitting in a savings account, although it could. You get to decide how the money in your RRSP is allocated. You might, in your RRSP, buy stocks or shares. And so the money that you put there gets to grow, right? So that is one investment vehicle you can use within an RRSP or a TFSA or an RESP, okay? So stocks or shares. There we go. So that's just like we've only scratched the surface, but hopefully you have a bit of an idea of what we're talking about now. Now, bonds and T-bills, they're very, very similar. The difference between them is how long you hold them for. So bonds are more than 1 year. Okay. So you put your money away for more than 1 year, up to 30 years. I've never seen a bond longer than 30 years, although I'm sure they probably exist. T-bills are always less than 2 years. But other than that, they work extremely similarly. They're basically the same thing. So a T-bill is basically a short-term bond. And here's what they are. You take your money and you go and you buy a $1,000 bond. And bonds come in all different denominations depending on who you're getting them from. And so you invest your $1,000 and they give you a bond and they say, here is your bond. And you're like, okay, thank you. And you maybe buy a 5-year bond. So say you bought a $1,000 bond for 5 years. So you hold on to this bond certificate, and there's lots of different kinds of bonds. Some of them literally are you holding on to it. They're called bearer bonds, and they often talk about those in the movies. So you hold on to this certificate for 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, you go back and say, I would like my money back. So you put your $1,000 into this bond, and at the end of 5 years, they give you back your money with interest on it. And so, depending on what the interest rate was, maybe they say, here is $1,300 back. And that $300 was how much interest they paid you. Okay, so a bond is basically you are loaning money to and then it can be anything. It can be a country, it can be a city, it can be a province, it can be a company. Okay, so you're lending money to one of those things for a fixed length of time. And it's anywhere from 1 to 30 years. Okay, and so why would the company want your money? Well, let's say that, like the province of Ontario sells bonds, right? And the country of Canada sells bonds. And so maybe Bracebridge has decided that they want to build a new arena, right? And they don't have the money right now to build a new arena, so they want to get a loan. But they don't want to go to the bank to get a loan because the bank charges a lot, and they say, you know what, I'm going to talk to people in the community and say, if you lend me $1,000, I will pay you 5% per year for 5 years. And you're like, wow, that's way better than what I can get at the bank. Here's my $1,000. I'll come in 5 years and you can give me back that $1,000 plus all of the interest that you owe me. Okay. And so that's exactly how a bond works. And so Bracebridge does something with that. They take that $1,000 and they use it to help build the arena. And then the hopes is that the arena makes some money back, or through taxes, Bracebridge raises the money so that when you come back in 5 years, they say, here's your $1,000 plus however much interest it is that you have earned. Okay. And that's what a bond is. But here's the restriction: you can't get your money back early. You can't withdraw early. And get interest. So let's say, and there are different rules about these two, but at its simplest, you take $1,000 and you go and you lend it to Bracebridge, and they say, okay, come back in 5 years. 3.5 years later, you're like, holy crap, I'm in dire straits. I need my money. And you go and you say, I want my money back. And Bracebridge says, okay, here's your $1,000. And you're like, wait. You had my money for 3.5 years. Don't I get interest? No, you don't, because the contract was a 5-year contract and you broke that contract. So you don't get any of your money interest back. You only get the interest at the very, very end. Okay. So it's very restrictive. They're fairly safe, but they have lots of restrictions. You can't withdraw early and get interest. Whereas if your money was in the bank and you were intending on investing for 5 years, but after 3.5 years, you're like, I have to get my money out, you'll earn interest on the money the entire time it was there. Or if it was in stocks and shares, maybe you were intending to put it for 5 years, but after 3.5 years, you take it out. And whatever it was at, if it's higher, you get that. If it's lower, you lose that, right? But bonds, you don't get your interest if you withdraw it early. And that's true of T-bills as well. So that's why it's really important to know your investment horizon. If you are confident that you're not going to need your money for 5 years, then a bond is a very secure, depending on who you get it from, place to put your money and get some interest. They're very much less volatile than what stock markets are. Okay. And so if you know that you're gonna, like, so a T-bill, let's say that you're saving for a car, and you've got some money, and but you don't have enough money yet, and you don't want to just leave it in a bank account because it pays so little interest. But let's say that you're not going to need your money for 2 years. You could go into the bank and say, I want to buy an 18-month T-bill. And they're like, okay. And you can get a T-bill that will pay you interest. And at the end of the 18 months, you'll get your money back and the interest. But if you take it out early, you don't get anything. So the interest rates are going to be higher. Okay, so interest rates are very much higher, than bank accounts. Okay, so it is higher than a bank account. And the interesting thing about bonds and T-bills is that the interest rate is dependent on how relatively risky the investment is considered. And you might think, well, how does that work? Well, imagine this. Imagine that, um, I don't know, Miss Imrie really wanted to start up a theater company. And she said, you can buy a 5-year bond in my theater company, and I will pay you 3% interest. And then at the end of 5 years, you can come and get your money back. You're like, okay, that's better than a bank account. But then you do some research, and the province of Ontario also sells bonds. And the province of Ontario says, for a 5-year bond, we'll pay you 3% interest. Well, which one of those do you suppose is more likely to for sure have your money at the end of 5 years? Well, the province of Ontario, it's a pretty safe bet that they're going to have money or access to money to give you back your money plus interest. Whereas in 5 years' time, maybe Miss Imrie's, drama company hasn't done all that well, and you go to get your money back, and they're like, "Yeah, sorry, I don't have money to give back to you." So it's riskier. So if you get to choose, you're going to choose to put your money into the most secure. So, if the government of Canada is selling bonds, and they do, and it's the same interest rate from the government of Canada as it is from Miss Imrie, well, you're going to put it in the safest one that gives the same interest. So that means that more risky places have to say, well, we'll give you more interest. So, maybe the government of Canada says, we'll give you 3%. It's pretty much a sure thing that you're going to get your money back from the government of Canada. So then the province of Ontario is like, well, we're pretty good, but we're not as good as the government of Canada. So the province of Ontario, maybe they have to pay 3.5% to attract enough people. And it's like, well, why would I put it in Ontario when I can get 3% from from Canada? And they're like, well, 3.5% is more. I feel pretty good about Ontario, so I'm going to buy Ontario bonds instead. That means that Miss Imrie, who's riskier, she might have to say, well, maybe I have to pay 5%. And you're like, okay, I know there's some risk involved, but I still feel pretty good. And that way I'd be getting an extra 1.5% even above Ontario. So I'm going to give my money to Miss Imrie. Okay, so bonds, the riskier the perceived return of your money is, the higher the interest rate is going to be. Okay, because the place that wants your money is going to have to pay more. Otherwise, you're going to go to the more secure place. So, countries, generally speaking, have historically been very, very secure places to put your money. And so the interest rate that they offered on their bonds was not really generally all that high. Of note is more recently, some countries have fallen on dire times, and it's not a guarantee that you get your money back. So Greece had a financial meltdown a few years ago where, people had lent Greece money in the form of bonds. They went to get their money back from Greece, and Greece was like, yeah, see, here's the thing. I don't really have the money to pay you back. And so people are like, what? And all kinds of financial nightmares were going on and happening, and complicated stuff. But suffice it to say now that Greece used to only maybe have to pay 3% for people to be interested in getting their bonds. Now Greece would have to pay 10% before people would be willing to get their bonds because it's just too risky, right? And so credit ratings, so countries and organizations have credit ratings, just like we talked about for people having credit ratings. Okay, so that's what a bond or a T-bill is you're lending money to a company or an individual, not an individual usually, a company, a big company, or a city or a province or a country, and they give you interest and you get it back at the end. Now, you only get interest if you cash it out at the end. I'm going to say that even though there's other ways to do it, there are, it's called secondary markets that you can trade your bonds in, but that gets really, really complicated. So that's what bonds are. So stocks and shares, you're a part owner of a company and you go up or down with how well the company does. A bond or a T-bill, it might also be investing in a company, but it doesn't really impact what your return is. Your return is negotiated ahead of time. So you know how much money, unless something goes wrong, you're going to get at the end of your bond or T-bill investment. Whereas with stocks or shares, you really have no idea how much it's going to be worth towards the end of your investment. Okay, so those are two of the biggest places that you can put money. So you can have bonds or T-bills or stocks or shares in your RRSP or in your TFSA or in your RESP. These are all different ways that you can invest to grow your money. So, biggest thing about stocks is this thing right here, that you have to buy in blocks of 100. And most people don't have enough money to buy all the different stocks that they're interested in, but they want to diversify their portfolio, which means that if any one thing goes down, it's not going to destroy them. Like, you don't want to put all of your money in one company like Intel, because if it goes down, that's all of your money. Whereas if if Nortel is only a little piece of your investment portfolio, it going down is not that big a deal, because hopefully you've got enough other stocks that are going up that it will balance that out. So you want to have a balanced portfolio. But it's hard to do with stocks because each investment in stocks requires such a large chunk of money. Okay? And the volatility kind of scares people away. Enter something now called mutual funds. So mutual funds are, I'm going to kind of give a bit of a definition here. It's a basket of investments where people pool their money to buy a diverse portfolio of investments. So the reason it's called a mutual fund is because you are investing mutually with other people. Okay. So let's say that you want to buy 10 different stocks. And if you had to buy all of the blocks of those 10 different stocks, it would cost you $100,000, which is not inconceivable at all. Okay. If you wanted to buy those 10 different stocks, it could easily cost you that. That's a huge amount of money. Most of us don't have the money to do that. But let's say that you really want to buy some of Apple and you want to buy some of Google and you want to buy some of Tesla and you want to buy some of Colgate and you want to buy some of Captain Crunch. I don't really care, but it would take a large chunk of money to be able to buy stocks in all of those things. Well, what you can do is these mutual funds, and there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions or hundreds of millions. I don't know what the count is now. Different baskets of investments where you pool your money. So let's say that you and 50 other friends all decide that you want to buy the same shares, but individually you can't buy them. So you say, well, I'll put in $1,000, and they say, well, I'll put in $1,000, and you get all of those people to put in their $1,000, and now you have enough to buy all of those different stocks that you're interested in, and you become a part owner of all of those different stocks. Okay. So a mutual fund is a basket where people pool their money to buy a diverse portfolio. Okay. Now, that means that mutual funds, you can invest as much or as little, generally speaking, invest as much or as little as you choose. Okay, so maybe you really want to buy some of Apple, but Apple shares are, I don't even know what they're going for now, a lot. You don't have enough money to do that. But what you can do is you can buy into a mutual fund that owns Apple, and you can buy a piece of the mutual fund. And so the mutual fund, if Apple goes up, the mutual fund goes up. If Apple goes down, the mutual fund goes down. And so it's not like it's only one thing. It will be usually a diverse portfolio. So mutual funds are broken up into different, usually segments of the financial market. So it might be you want to invest in tech stocks. So maybe there's a mutual fund that just has Microsoft and Sun Microsystems and Apple. That's all they do. They just invest in those three companies, and you're like, all right, so I'm going to buy a tech mutual fund because you think that tech is going to keep on going up. Or there's automotive mutual funds that have money, they invest in Ford and Toyota and Mazda and Chevy, right? And so that's what they have. So any market that you can think of, there are mutual funds that are made up of all kinds of different stocks in that thing. So if you think that gold is going to become more valuable because people want to pull their currency out of dollars and put it somewhere safer, then you could buy a mutual fund company or a mutual fund that invests in gold companies. And so if gold companies go up, the mutual fund goes up. So a mutual fund, it's a basket of investments where everybody invests. Now, generally speaking, a mutual fund has a dedicated manager. So there is a person that their only job is to manage what is happening in that mutual fund. And so that market manager, they take advantage. So she sits there and she watches all of the gold shares. And if any one gold share, so let's say that, there's a gold company that did something bad, and they destroyed a treaty or something, and all of a sudden that gold company starts to go down. If you personally own stocks in that gold company, you probably wouldn't see that until you got home from work that night, if you checked then, or maybe not until the weekend. And so maybe that stock went from $100 down to $50 and you lost 50%. Well, a dedicated manager, their job is literally just to watch what is going on with their fund. And so if any one stock starts to go down, That's what their job is. They're watching and they see and they're like, oh, I got to get out of that stock right away. So instead of riding it from $100 down to $50, maybe they ride it from $100 down to $90 so it doesn't go down as much. Or maybe they're watching other stocks and they see that, this other new company to the market, maybe they've found out that they've hit a really profitable vein of gold and everyone's starting to hear about it, and the stock goes from being $5 and it just starts to skyrocket in price. If you're at work, you're going to miss out on that jump. Whereas the dedicated stock market manager or mutual fund manager, they have the opportunity to get into it right away. So they've got a dedicated manager that in theory should make, in theory, what this should do is it should improve returns, right? That's the idea, is it improve returns. Because that's what their job is. That's all they do, is they watch what's going on there. Okay. So mutual funds, this is, I would say this is where most people's, this is probably the biggest investment in RRSPs that exists. RRSPs and other places. Okay. Mutual funds. So why wouldn't we just invest in mutual funds? Well, as with everything, they have some drawbacks. Because there's this dedicated manager, they need to get paid. And so there is often a fee associated with mutual funds. And every mutual fund is different. Okay, sometimes the fee is a one-time fee. When you buy the mutual fund, you pay $100 per fund that you buy. Or usually, however, the mutual fund fee is a percent per year. Now, depending on the fund, that can be anywhere from 1 to 3% per year. So it might be 1% all the way up to 3%, and they might even be higher than that per year. So that means if you have it as an example, let's say that you have $100,000 in your mutual fund at the beginning of the year. That means 3% right off the top. They're going to take 3,000 of that mutual fund, and you're only going to have $97,000 in your mutual fund. Now, the hopes is that will grow with the markets, and maybe it'll be worth $110,000. And you're like, I don't care that it cost me $3,000 because I had that big profit. Okay, $3,000 if you're making profit, or 3% when you're making profit, isn't necessarily a big deal. But let's say that you put that $100,000 away, and the markets go down, and you end up with only $90,000 because the markets went down. You still are going to lose that 3%. And you're only going to end up with $87,000, right? And so that is the big detriment to mutual funds, is that there are, generally speaking, fees associated with them, okay? So, ladies and gentlemen, that is simply scratching the surface of investments, but I want you to have an idea of what is going on. So let's recap really, really quickly. So, you have banks, checking account and savings account, but generally speaking, you don't want to leave a lot of money sitting in a bank for a long length of time because it's shrinking because of inflation. Okay, inflation is what causes prices, or is what means prices are going up year over year. Okay, so they're not really investments, they're just a temporary place to put your money. Okay, investments, the big vehicles that you use, RRSP, it's a retirement savings plan that you get to put your money in tax-free. It grows tax-free, but you pay tax on the way out. TFSA, almost the same thing, but you pay tax on the way in, not on the way out. And RESP, you're putting money away for education for somebody, and the government contributes 20% up to a maximum of $400. Now, within each of those things, you have to decide where to put your money. There's stocks. Stocks are, you part owner of the company. You can make money from dividends, where you share the profits, or buying low and selling high. There's bonds. That's where you lend money to an organization and they pay you a fixed interest rate, but you don't have access to the interest until the maturity. And then there are mutual funds. And that's where a whole bunch of people pool their money together to buy a diverse portfolio. It's managed by a certain individual, or bigger mutual funds by multiple individuals. You can invest as much or as little as you choose for however long you choose as well. That's another big piece. Depends on how long you want to put it there. You could be in for as little period of time as you want, but there are usually fees associated with them. It's often a percentage. Sometimes it's a percentage just on the way in. When you first buy it, it's a one-time thing, but more and more mutual funds, it's getting to be a percentage per year. Okay. So certainly there are other places that you can put your money. Real estate is a big one. It's risky, but certainly has the opportunity to have really, really big thing. There's another thing called commodities. So commodities are like, you know what? I think that wheat is too inexpensive right now. You could arrange to buy 20 tons of wheat and just leave it in storage somewhere. And then later on, when people are like, huzzah, we want more wheat, and the price of wheat goes up, you can sell the wheat for more than what you paid for it, right? There are precious metals, right? Okay, so literally gold and silver. So you might say, I think that gold is going to go up in price, and you can go to, I mean, you can go to the post office, but there are better places than that, and you can literally buy chunks of gold and hold on to them. And if the price goes up, you go sell them later, and they're worth more, right? If you're really, really bored, you could invest in like magic cards. I'm not suggesting you should, but there are lots of different ways that you can invest. But what we talked about earlier are the bigger ones. Long lesson. I apologize, but hopefully you're a little bit more knowledgeable now for it. Okay. Thanks, guys.